saved his valuable art. But in 1946, it was time to save himself. Albert Speer appeared before the Nuremberg war trials with other leading Nazis. He convinced prosecutors that he was an artist, unaware of the facts, and seemed to scorn his former master.
Was war die Entscheidung Hitlers?
Die Entscheidung war ein unbrauchbarer Kompromiss, wie oft bei Hitler.
The co-accused watched with great rage how the Führer's favorite, who they had all been so jealous of, how he now pulls his head out of the noose.
Albert Speer was the only senior Nazi who conceded a general responsibility for Nazi war crimes without admitting to any personal guilt.
Albert Speer.
His life hung in the balance.
Nicht schuldig.
They fell for it, because he was a defendant who appeared to be showing remorse, and the rest were quite remarkable for not doing so. And I think that's what saved him. He would have hanged otherwise.
Spared the hangman's noose, the man once tipped to succeed his Führer, Adolf Hitler, was sentenced to 20 years in Spandau prison. The one-time Nazi grandee was now prisoner number 5. 3 years after the end of the war, an American interrogator questioned him about his art collection.
If you're a questioner, no matter how realistic or truthful or valuable an answer seems to be, you always let yourself know that you know that may not be the true state of affairs.
Speer lied. He claimed that he only had a small collection and had not acquired anything after 1937. In reality, he had bought paintings from Hitler's chief supplier Karl Haberstock right up to 1940.
Karl Haberstock stripped Jewish art dealers and collectors across Europe of some of the finest artworks ever collected, and he sold them to the leaders of the Nazi regime for their personal collections.
And Albert Speer was among his most important buyers. On the 1st of October 1966, he was a free man. As well as hidden art, he had another big potential earner to cash in on: his memoirs. His release created a media sensation, and Hitler's architect knew how to build a fortune around it.
Speer was a gifted communicator. He'd had a long time to work out what you might call his alibi. He'd found the perfect formula for taking a degree of responsibility for the atrocities perpetrated by the Third Reich while not accepting personal culpability for them. And I think he knew that, in a sense, he spoke for and to the German people, all of those who'd lived through the Third Reich. He was telling them what they wanted to hear, and they were rewarding him by buying his books, by applauding his appearances.
As well as selling books, others feel he had another motivation: to clear his name from the stain of Nazi war crimes.
But I think so much of his sort of mission in later life was to kind of, what we'd now call the Chatzo circuit, to kind of help clear his name and come across as a very distinguished, refined, patrician German. And that was the kind of the figure that he cut at Nuremberg that made the prosecutors feel that he probably wasn't quite as bad as all the rest and therefore didn't deserve the rope.
Sie sehen ja an meinem Zustand, dass ich nach 20 Jahren noch verhältnismäßig gut aussehe. Ja?
He was uniquely placed. He did have this reputation of being the honest man, the good Nazi, and he was going to exploit it. And various people came along and interviewed him, and it started to build up, you know, this reputation for being the good guy among bad guys.
The image of the good Nazi was a highly profitable one. 6 weeks after his release from Spandau prison, he was paid 50,000 marks for an exclusive interview. He also played the penitent Nazi, claiming, "I will not be able to shed the burden put on me by the enormity of these crimes." He repeated claims that he thought of assassinating Hitler and explained why he kept the details to himself. When they fail, assassination attempts have a strong tendency towards the ridiculous. That's why I mentioned the plans against Hitler only briefly during the Nuremberg trials.
Repeat this oath after me. I swear by God. The Almighty and Omniscient.
It followed evidence he'd given 20 years before.
Wollten Sie das Attentat selbst durchführen? Warum scheiterte diese Ihre Absicht?
Ich möchte über die Einzelheiten hier nicht weiter mich ausführen.
This is part of his self-mythologizing. You know, he told the story how in January 1945 he wanted to pour poison gas into an air intake valve in the bunker, and he couldn't find a ladder and, you know, get over the wall. And I'm reminded of a remark by his rival architect Hermann Giesler, who said, "The second most powerful man in the Third Reich, and he couldn't find a ladder."
If he really had assassination plans, solid, real assassination plans against Hitler, why doesn't he just pull out a gun and shoot the dictator?
Hitler's former organizer and industrial supremo spent years refining his memoirs. He admitted responsibility, but never any personal guilt. His books would go on to become bestsellers.
It was a very polished production and a sensation at the time because no book like that existed. It still doesn't. Here was a key insider who knew Hitler and therefore had a lot to reveal.
He had the ability to create myths about his life and his behavior during the Third Reich. He wrote the first draft of his own biography, and that gave him an advantage and allowed him to portray himself as idealistic, as disavowing material gain.
Hitler's former armaments minister built himself another fortune, a fortune built on lies and half-truths. He claimed that the night he spent at his friend's country house in the dying days of Hitler's Reich was without purpose or reason, when he was desperately rescuing paintings likely to have been looted from Jews or forcibly sold. Speer gave the impression that he didn't know anything about Jewish-owned art. He didn't know anything specific about the Holocaust.
Speer had never expressed much contrition about the fate of the Jews. He had simply not discussed it. But he was advised that it would be good for his reputation, it would make his story more acceptable to West Germans and indeed an international audience, if he at least acknowledged that the Jews had suffered terribly in the Third Reich and that he was sorry about that.
Rudolf Wolters, a confidant and family friend who had looked after his affairs during his time in prison, was dismayed by Speer's self-portrayal. His old friend clearly stated what he thought of Speer's selective recollections. Dear Albert, I sit here chewing my fountain pen, torn this way and that between old friendly emotions and instinctive disgust. A criminal story couldn't have been made up in a more gripping way.
Wolters was a lot of other people too, who former participants in the regime, were very annoyed with him, but he kept on saying, you know, it was disgraceful and I bore my part of the general responsibility. And their reaction was, shut up, for goodness sake, just leave it, you know.
But Speer continued playing the penitent Nazi. It was a role he perfected with the help of his ghostwriter, Joachim Fest. He was writing a Hitler biography at the same time, and Albert Speer was a vital contributor to his book as well.
Hitler hat es verstanden, die Dinge, die vorbereitete, geheim zu halten. Es hätte mir nicht unbemerkt bleiben dürfen, wenn ich nicht gedankenlos in den Tag gelebt hätte und mich in meine Baupläne geflüchtet hätte. Ich fühle mich für Auschwitz noch heute mitverantwortlich.
But cracks began to appear in Albert Speer's image as the good Nazi in 1971. Historians suggested he was present when SS chief Heinrich Himmler delivered a notorious speech in the now Polish city of Posen. In that speech, Himmler made a rare and candid statement about the fate of Jewish people in the Nazi Reich. The tough decision had to be made to exterminate these people from the face of the earth. Albert Speer had an alibi. He had left before Himmler's speech. But Speer's story didn't add up. Himmler had addressed him personally. Of course, this has nothing to do with party member Speer. You can't do anything about this.
It incriminated every single person in the room. That speech was proof of knowledge and therefore a degree of responsibility. It was therefore crucial for Speer to provide evidence that he had left the meeting in Posen before Himmler made that speech, that he was not aware of what Himmler had said.
Was he or was he not present when Himmler made that famous speech at Poznan or Posen? And he spent an awful lot of time later in life trying to prove he wasn't there. And then, well, yes, he was there, but he missed the vital bit because he left to go somewhere else. And, you know, it was another aspect of this crumbling.
He was a central pillar of the war effort. He was exploiting concentration camp and slave labor. He knew what was happening to the Jews. So it didn't really matter whether he'd been in the room when Himmler made his speech, because he was up to his neck in the crimes of the Nazi state.
He managed to shrug it off. It's amazing. They used to say of Ronald Reagan, he was a Teflon man, and maybe Speer was a Teflon man as well. A lot of this stuff just didn't stick.
But perhaps something did stick to his conscience. Albert Speer sought consolation and salvation at a Benedictine monastery where he was a regular visitor. Father Athanasius Wolff became the war criminal's confidant.
He once told me, "You know, Father, I understand when people don't want to talk to me, because I didn't say many things or said it incorrectly. I understand when people don't want to shake my hand, because I was missing. But I hope there is something like God's forgiveness." And then suddenly God's name was in the conversation.
Unlike the countless victims of his slave labor projects, Albert Speer could escape into religion. He was free to indulge in quiet solitude, yet even in a monastery, could not openly confess to his Nazi war crimes.
He wanted to say, "I didn't know about it," but at the same time he openly said, "If I had known about it, I wouldn't have been able to act, so I suppressed it in order to be able to act." That means there was this ambivalence, that he made a confession and at the same time withdrew the confession.